Emergency alert. A zombie outbreak detected in the downtown area. Multiple reports of violent, aggressive individuals attacking citizens. Hospitals overwhelmed. Authorities are scrambling for control. The infection is spreading fast. Get to safety now. This is not a drill. Lizzie is reporting for Winds Radio.
Everything seemed normal, until it didn't. For hours, life had gone on as usual. People went about their business, children played in their yards, and the streets were filled with the usual noise. The world seemed right. But it wouldn't stay that way. At first, it was nothing. Just a few odd calls. A neighbor reporting strange behavior. A store clerk saying a customer acted differently. No one took it seriously. Not yet. They thought it was just a bad day for a few people. They thought it was just a temporary thing. But it wasn't temporary. And soon, it wasn't just a few people. It was hundreds. It was thousands. It was a city, slowly turning into something else. Something wrong. By the time the first reports of bites came in, it was already too late. People didn't know what was happening. How could they? Who could have known? The first signs were strange. A few reports of people attacking each other. The kind of thing that would usually be handled by the police with no trouble at all. But this was different. By the time the authorities understood what was really going on, the city had already started to crumble. What had started as a small issue was now a full-blown crisis. People tried to go about their days, to pretend it wasn't happening. The news stations flashed the warnings. Ambulances were called. But nothing stopped the inevitable. It was already spreading. It was too late. Now, the streets that had once been full of people going about their business were suddenly abandoned. The air was heavy with the sound of sirens, echoing through empty roads. People locked themselves inside their homes. Doors were bolted shut. Windows were covered with whatever could block the view. The virus was in the city. And there was no escaping it. Then came the first truly terrifying moment. The infected. They didn't look human anymore. They didn't walk like us. They didn't talk like us. There was nothing left of the people they used to be. The first time you saw them, you knew. You knew something was horribly, terribly wrong. They shuffled in the streets, their eyes wide and bloodshot, empty. There was no recognition in them. No fear. No humanity left. The only thing that remained was the hunger. They weren't alive anymore. But they were still walking, still moving, still coming. People tried to fight back. They tried to hold their ground. But what do you do when the enemy doesn't stop? What do you do when they keep coming? When the city you live in starts to lose the fight? The world was changing. And it was changing fast. In just hours, the virus had spread like wildfire. At first, it was confined to the downtown area. But then it spread to the suburbs. The infection didn't care about neighborhoods. It didn't care who you were. It didn't care about anything except spreading further. The city was losing control. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses couldn't keep up. The police were outnumbered. And the infected weren't slowing down. They kept coming. And the sirens? They didn't matter anymore. They were just noise. And then, the screams. You could hear them all over the city. High-pitched, desperate. At first, it was one or two. But soon, the air was filled with them. People tried to scream, to shout for help. But there was no one to help them. The streets were full of chaos. People ran. They ran without looking back. But even as they ran, they knew. They knew it was already too late. It was no longer just a matter of surviving the day. It was about surviving the next hour. The next minute. The next second, the infection was spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. And the city, as it had been, was no more. It had become a battleground. And no one knew how to fight back. Not yet. In the early stages, there was hope. People thought they could outrun the infection. They thought they could escape. But it wasn't about escaping anymore. It wasn't about running. It was about survival. It was about making it through the night. Take Chris, for example. Chris wasn't anyone special. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a hero. He was just a man with a backpack, trying to get home. He had no idea what he was walking into. No idea that the world around him was crumbling. He was just trying to get back to his wife and daughter. But then, Chris heard the first scream. It wasn't the kind of scream that made you think someone was in trouble. It was a scream that made you think that someone, somewhere, had lost their mind. He didn't know why, but he knew it wasn't normal. It wasn't something you heard every day. And then he saw it. Chris turned the corner and froze. He didn't know what he was looking at. He didn't understand it. People, or what used to be people, were dragging themselves down the street. Their movements were wrong. Jerky, twisted, unnatural. They weren't walking like anyone should walk. They weren't moving like anyone should move. Their faces were a nightmare. Their eyes were bloodshot, empty. They weren't looking at Chris. They weren't looking at anything. But they were coming for him. They moved without reason. Without thought. They just moved. Chris stood there for a moment, paralyzed. And then, his feet moved on their own. He didn't think. He didn't stop. He ran. Chris ran, with his breath sharp in his throat. He didn't think about where he was going. He didn't think about anything except getting away. His flashlight bounced against the pavement as he sprinted, trying to outpace the sound of footsteps behind him. But no matter how fast he ran, it wasn't fast enough. The infected were right behind him. And they were getting closer. Every corner he turned, there were more of them. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he pushed himself, there were more. He couldn't outrun them. There was no way to outrun something that didn't care about anything. Something that just wanted more. Chris was running out of options. He turned down another alley, hoping for a way out, but all he found were more of them. The city, once filled with the sounds of life, was now filled with the sounds of death. The air was thick with it. The screams. The growls. The relentless shuffle of footsteps. He could hear them now. They were closing in. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, louder than his footsteps. He looked ahead, but there was no escape. Not here. Not now. He was trapped. And then, as if fate had already decided, the first infected reached him. Their hands, cold and clawing, grasped at him. He didn't have time to react. He didn't have time to fight. All he had was the fear that he would never see his family again. As the outbreak escalated, hospitals became ground zero. At first, it was just a few strange cases. But it didn't take long for the situation to worsen. The first signs were small. A few people showing up with bite marks, at first just a scratch, maybe even a scratch that didn't look too dangerous. But soon, that was no longer the case. Soon, there were more. And more. It was spreading fast. Too fast. Doctors, nurses, they were used to handling chaos. But this? This was unlike anything anyone had seen before. The ER, once a place of calm, had turned into a war zone. Injured civilians flooded in, screaming, begging for help. But no one could help them. The hospital wasn't big enough. The doctors weren't prepared for what was coming through those doors. The infected weren't just a few isolated cases anymore. They were everywhere. In the hallways. In the waiting rooms. Their eyes wide with panic, but not with fear. No, they had no fear. Only hunger. And it wasn't just the bites anymore. It was the behavior. The aggression. The way they attacked. It was vicious, it was primal, and it was something no one had ever seen before. No one was prepared for this. A man, once a patient, now something else entirely, lunged at a nurse. His body had grown pale, his skin slick with sweat. His eyes, wide, unblinking, empty. And before the nurse could even react, he was on her, tearing into her with the strength of something far beyond human. The screams that followed echoed through the halls, each one more desperate than the last. Now, the hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a death trap. The doors that should have kept people safe were now keeping them trapped. The corridors filled with chaos. Medical staff, trying to treat the wounded, but the wounded were attacking them. Biting them. Ripping into them with no more mercy than the creatures doing the same to others. People who had walked in for treatment were now attacking anyone in sight. Nobody was safe. Not even those who were trying to help. Not the doctors. Not the nurses. Not the patients who had come in for something as simple as a broken bone or a sprained ankle. It didn't matter. They all became prey. And it wasn't just the bites anymore. That's how it started, yes. But the infection was evolving. It wasn't just taking lives. It was changing them. The infected were no longer mindless, shuffling, groaning zombies. They were different now. They were stronger. Faster. They were learning. Adapting. The same terror that had once been something slow, sluggish, was now something far worse. These were the kinds of creatures that didn't wait to be destroyed. These were creatures that could think. They could hunt. They could organize. They could work together. At that moment, the city was lost. The hospitals, once symbols of safety and recovery, had now become the breeding grounds of this nightmare. Hope came in the form of escape routes. A few survivors had managed to gather, to organize, to prepare for what was coming. They found cars, they packed them with what little they could carry, and they made a run for it. They knew they couldn't stay in the city. They knew they had to get out. And for a moment, they thought maybe they could. Maybe they could make it. But as the survivors tried to flee the city, something far worse was waiting for them. There was no safe haven. No place that was free from what was hunting them. Those who were lucky enough to escape had no idea what was closing in on them. The city, now a war zone, seemed to breathe with them. The streets, filled with shattered glass, burning buildings, and abandoned vehicles, were silent. Almost too silent. But there was a sound. The low, constant shuffle of footsteps in the distance. The sound of the infected, drawn toward anything that was still alive. At first, it seemed like just a small group of survivors trying to escape. But as the darkness settled in, a figure appeared on the edge of a parking lot. At first, it was just a shadow. But as the figure stepped into the light, the survivors realized they were facing something different. This man, this figure, wasn't just another person trying to survive. He wasn't just another lost soul in the chaos. His eyes, glowing yellow in the dark, told them everything they needed to know. He stood still for a moment, watching. And then he slowly raised his arms, as though commanding the night itself. And at that moment, something changed. The infected, once scattered and aimless, began to move as one. They began to gather, to move in sync. They weren't just attacking randomly anymore. They weren't just shuffling through the streets. They were being guided. Led. And that was the moment they realized the infection wasn't just spreading through bites anymore. It was spreading through something much worse. It was spreading through coordination. The infected were learning. They were adapting. And the man who had raised his arms? He wasn't a survivor. He was something else. He was a signal. A beacon. A leader. And with that signal, the infected responded. They moved together, as one, closing in on anything that could still be saved. They were no longer just mindless animals. They were becoming an army. And with every passing second, they were growing stronger, smarter, and more deadly. No longer could anyone think they were safe. Not in the city. Not in the countryside. The infection had learned to organize. And now, it was coming for everything that was still standing. The survivors didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to go. They didn't know how to fight this new threat. And even if they did, it didn't matter. The city wasn't just a place anymore. It was a battlefield. A hunting ground. And the infected weren't just attacking. They were hunting. They were learning how to win. Some people fought back. It was no longer about making plans or making sense of what had happened. They had no choice. They had to fight. They had to stand, even though deep down they knew it wasn't enough. The barricades they built were flimsy, made from whatever they could scrounge up. Metal scraps, wood, bricks, they didn't matter. In the end, it was all just a temporary hold against something that had no mercy. The survivors, gripped by terror, armed themselves with whatever they could find. It didn't matter if it was a bat, a knife, a broken bottle, anything. There was no other option. They had to fight, had to try. But their weapons were weak compared to the monsters they faced. The infected didn't care about human life. They didn't care about pain. They were driven by something else, something primal. Hunger. The sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows over the makeshift barricade, a false sense of protection. As the light faded, the night grew more sinister. The survivors were trapped in a corner of the city they thought would be their salvation. They weren't the first to try to make a stand here. But they would be the last. They had no idea how many of the infected were out there, how many were closing in, getting closer, drawn by the noise, by the scent of living flesh. They only knew they couldn't stay here. They couldn't run. Not anymore. They had to fight, even if it was futile. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder. Their eyes wide, faces pale, hands shaking as they gripped their makeshift weapons. Some held their children close, whispering prayers to themselves. Others looked like they were trying to prepare for the end. Each one was ready to make their stand. But they weren't ready for what was coming next. Then, they came. The infected. First, it was one. A lone figure, stumbling forward, dragging its feet, its mouth hanging open. Then another. And another. Until there were too many to count. They closed in on the barricade, their bodies jerking unnaturally with every step, eyes empty of anything but hunger. The survivors gripped their weapons tighter, and then they heard it. The sound of the infected's growls. It wasn't just a sound. It was a signal. A sign that the end was near. But they stood, and they fought. They swung their bats, their knives. They stabbed and swung with all their might. And yet, no matter how many they knocked down, there were always more. There were always more. Then, it happened. One of the survivors, one who had fought the hardest, one who had held on to the last bit of hope, turned. His eyes glazed over, his face drained of color. The infection had taken hold, and no one saw it coming. He lunged at his former allies. His body jerked unnaturally as he screamed in desperation, a sound that didn't belong to anyone human anymore. His teeth snapped, and he charged at the others, tearing into the closest person he could find. Suddenly, the survivors were no longer just fighting the infected outside. They were fighting each other. And it wasn't just about staying alive. It was about the nightmare that had become their reality. The lines between the living and the dead were beginning to blur, and with every second that passed, they realized what they were really up against. Fighting for survival wasn't just about fighting the monsters outside. It was about something much deeper. It was about surviving the horror within. The darkness that had taken hold of the world, and the darkness that was creeping inside them all. They weren't just fighting the infected. They were fighting what they were becoming. What the world had turned them into. As the survivors fought for their lives, they realized there was no escape. The infected were everywhere. The barricades were useless. And the hardest truth of all? No matter how hard they fought, they couldn't stop what was coming. The world they knew, the world they had once thought was safe, was gone. And nothing was left except this battle. The battle to survive in a world that no longer cared about them. The city was falling apart, and everyone knew it. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Buildings burned in the distance. Sirens blared, but no one was listening anymore. They had heard the warnings before, but now, the reality was clear: the city was lost. The infection was everywhere. And no matter how many military trucks rolled through the streets, no matter how many helicopters flew overhead, it was too late. The evacuation orders came through loudspeakers, booming across the city. But the message was too late. The infection had spread too far. The infected were everywhere. The shelters were already overrun. The military couldn't stop them. They were already outnumbered. And everyone who was still alive was left with one choice: survive. Every second counts. If you're not already preparing, it's time to start. You have to move now. Grab whatever you can. Your food, your water, your weapons. You don't have time to hesitate. You don't have time to waste. The infected are learning, adapting. They're getting smarter. They're evolving. And if you want to survive, you have to do the same. The infected are no longer just wandering the streets. They're hunting. They're organized. And it's only a matter of time before they learn how to break through your defenses. The city is gone. The shelters are full. There's nowhere to hide. But there's still a chance. You can still survive. But only if you act now. You have to think faster. Be smarter. The world you knew is over. You can't go back. You can still make it. But you have to move fast. Get to a shelter. Seal the doors. Do whatever it takes to stay alive. The infection is everywhere, and it's only a matter of time before it finds you. So, what will you do? What's your next move? This isn't a test. It's happening now. The clock is ticking. You have one choice: stay silent. Stay alert. And stay alive.